Welcome. Thank you for watching this teaching video from Oak Tree Community Church in South Bend, Indiana. Please check out our other videos and don't forget to like and subscribe. Our mission is to help people come to know Jesus better and love Him more every day. We believe this will not only help our own spiritual growth, but also help us better influence the community and the world for Christ. For more information about Oak Tree, please visit us at oaktreechurch.com. There you'll find past message series, online giving options, and more information about our discipleship process that we call The Path. Now enjoy this message. We'd love to hear from you in the comments or the website contact form. Thank you.
Anyway, all right. So, for the first two chapters, he has been setting up his defending his apostolic authority, giving some history, making sure everybody's all on the same page, right? In 2:15, he started shifting into the doctrinal section, and he's laying out verses 15 and 16. He lays out the summary of really his entire doctrine. Now we're in chapter 3, and he really is going to drill down on some really important doctrine that surrounds this whole topic of justification through faith alone. And there are several Old Testament quotes, there are several Old Testament allusions, and he even brings in an allegory in chapter 4, where he sets up an Old Testament allegory, and some important things to cover as we look at this. So, verses 1 through 6, you foolish Galatians, who's cast a spell on you? Before your eyes, Jesus Christ was vividly portrayed as crucified. The only thing I want to learn from you is this. Did you receive the Spirit by doing the works of the law or by believing what you heard? Are you so foolish? Although you began with the Spirit, are you now trying to finish by human effort? Have you suffered so many things for nothing? If indeed it was for nothing, does God then give you the Spirit and work miracles among you by your doing the works of law or by your believing what you heard? Just as Abram believed God and it was credited to him as righteousness, so then, verse 7, understand that those who believe are the sons of Abraham. So, a couple of things. He's calling them on the carpet for their desertion of the faith. And you remember, all the way back in chapter 1, verse 6, it wasn't just desertion of the faith. He said, I'm astonished that you are so quickly deserting the one who called you, right? He looked at this as a desertion of God, not just a desertion of a belief system. And so he's calling them on the carpet for that. And he says, he calls them foolish. We see the word foolish both in verse 1 here and in verse 3. And in the net, it says, cast a spell on you. Okay, so NLT, cast an evil spell.
ASV, who did bewitch you.
Bewitch is common. That's what you've got too?
Well, ESV has bewitched.
ESV has bewitched? Bewitched. Okay, so it's bewitched. Yeah, that's how I memorized. That's how I grew up. Who has bewitched you? It's a pretty rare word. It doesn't show up very often. In fact, this is the only time it shows up in the New Testament. It doesn't show up anywhere else. And in the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the Septuagint, it shows up twice in Deuteronomy 28. That's it. That's the entire biblical use of this word, translated bewitch or cast a spell or whatever. And what's interesting is if we go back to Deuteronomy 28, verses 54 and 56. Just take a look at those couple of verses, 54 and 56. The context is if Israel does not obey God, then these are some of the curses that God is going to put on Israel. See if you can figure out where bewitched or cast a spell on shows up in 54 and 56. Turn against some of his. All right, so you said tender.
I was looking at what's repeated.
Okay. And you said no compassion. And you guys came up with
Tender and sensitive and tender and delicate.
turn against. Okay. You're going with tender and sensitive?
Yeah, the tender and sensitive and tender and delicate.
Anything else in the NLT that you would go with? Shows up again, right? All right. It is turn against. It is actually the turn against. And here is what the basically here's what the I saw that. Because there's only a couple entries, but here's in the lexicon. So in the dictionary, number 1 is to exert an evil influence through the eye. Okay, so bewitched as with an evil eye, gives someone the evil eye. According to Theocrates, one can ward off the evil eye by spitting 3 times. It's good to know. The second entry is to be resentful of something enjoyed by someone else, and so it's envy. And so in our Deuteronomy, which is still the evil eye, the green eye of envy. It comes back to this eye. The man among you who is by nature tender and sensitive will begin to envy what his other people have, because as the curses are coming down on Israel, they're starting to lose stuff, right? So he will actually turn against people he would never turn against because of his envy, because of this there's something in his eyes that has changed, in a sense, is the background behind it. He's looking at people whom he loves with a different look, is the background. That's why they chose this when they translated it, including his brother, his beloved wife, and his remaining children. I get that, his remaining children, those who haven't died yet. Yes. Yep. So likewise, the most tender and delicate of your women, who would never think of putting even the sole of her foot on the ground because of her daintiness, she'll start looking around at her husband and her sons and her daughters. And look at verse 57, because this is now going into famine. Secretly eat her afterbirth and her newborn children, since she has nothing else, because of the severity of the siege by which your enemy will constrict you in your villages. So Israel will actually turn to cannibalism, God promised, if they kept going down that path against him. And how that comes out is they start looking at each other like, what do you have that I don't have? What do you have? What do you have? Why do you have food? Why do you have? Because their eye will turn. That's the same thing that Paul says here, is why, who has bewitched you? Who has cast this spell on you? Who has caused you to start looking around saying, you have something I don't have, essentially. I gave you the gospel, you accepted the gospel, and now you're looking around for something else. You've been seduced into this. Isn't that interesting? Just that word there. Okay. So he also calls them foolish, which means, basically unintelligent. It's lack of mindfulness is what it means, this particular word. Mindless, dense, or unintelligent. And that reminds me that Christianity is not subject to just blind faith. Some people, you just have blind faith, just believe. No, we believe with evidence, we believe with intelligence. We don't just, Christianity is not just jump off of a cliff in blind faith, step off of a ledge. There is evidence, there is truth, there's doctrine, there's all of these things that God wants us to accept. And so he's saying, it's like you guys are, it's like you've been bewitched in such a way that You're turning against things. You're looking at each other with completely different eyes, and you're doing it without your brains. That's what he's saying. What are you doing? Now, he does say, now the net says, you foolish Galatians. In the Greek, it says, O. It actually has just a capital omega, O, foolish Galatians. And when that is used, it usually evokes some kind of tenderness, some kind of emotion. So, yes, he's calling them names. He's calling them foolish. He's calling them mindless. He's saying you're not using your brains, but he's doing it with at least a little bit of love behind it, right? What's that? Yeah. This, foolish Galatians. Yeah. He's not yelling. I mean, he's calling them on the carpet, but he's not yelling them. Yours does? Or does this one? Oh, yeah, you fool. Yeah, the exclamation point there. Yeah. There's this O in there. Oh, foolish Galatians. Like they've been hypnotized almost into thinking something that they shouldn't be. What's that? Bewitched, right, yeah. Right. Tom Constable, in his commentary, he says, the Galatians would not have found false teaching attractive if they had truly appreciated the major significance of Jesus' crucifixion. They're looking around like, what do you have? What do you have? What do you have? When Paul had already said, look at what you've been given. Right, like we're seeing in 1 John. It's everything, and they're looking around like they're missing out on something, envying, coveting what other people have. And so these guys come along and say, if you get circumcised, then you'll really be in with God. Ooh, why didn't Paul tell us about that? So, what did he do? He took them back to the beginning. He said, all right, I got 4 questions for you. 4 questions. Number 1, how did you get started? How did you start your spiritual journey? Was it by works or was it by faith? Let's go all the way back to the beginning. Works or faith? Okay, of course they had to say faith. That's what it was at the beginning, right? And the one thing I want you to notice here is that Paul did not question their salvation. He didn't say, oh, you've abandoned the gospel. Are you sure you're really saved? He said, I know you're saved. I was there. But how did you get it? I remember it. I need you to remember it. Right? So let's go all the way back to the beginning, to your salvation. How did you start this journey anyway? I find this so interesting in places like Galatians and Corinthians, where people are just falling away left and right, it seems like. The apostle never questions their faith, only their maturity. He never says, you better make sure you're saved. He says, you told me you're saved. I'm convinced you're saved, but you're not growing up. So how do we grow up? Even somebody like these people who were walking away from the gospel itself. There are a lot of people today who would say, oh, if you walk away from the gospel, then you were never saved to begin with. Paul said, I know you're saved, but you've been confused. So let's get you back on track. Okay? So how'd you get started? Number 2, so why do you think that a journey that starts with faith could be or even needed to be completed by human effort? What makes you think that? What brought you to that conclusion? Because I sure didn't tell you that. Right? What is it that brought you? What changed? You were on the right track, and this, I think this is a good model for us as we're counseling people, as we're working with people, as they're asking questions. If you've got somebody who starts doubting, like, oh, I'm not sure about this. All right, stop. Let's go back to the beginning. Go all the way back to the basics. And let's just, where did we get off track? Right? We do this in troubleshooting all the time, right? You do this with computers. You do this with lots of things. We do this with troubleshooting. It's just like, okay, all right, hold on, stop. Let's stop trying to fix this here. Let's go back. Let's retrace our steps. Let's see, where was it good? When did it turn bad? And what was the change? Right? We do this in life all the time. Almost every industry, almost every field has something where you have to do that. That's the exact same tactic that Paul used here. Where'd you get off track? Why would you even think that? And this question actually helps us avoid two extremes. And extremes are almost always bad, right? Almost always do we find the extremes are bad. We want to stay away from extremes. On one extreme is legalism. And legalism says that the law can make us acceptable to God. The law can make us acceptable to God. And where legalism shows is in one of two places. If it's just in me, then what you're seeing in me is somebody who's really almost hamster wheelish. Legalism makes us hamster wheelish. We're just constantly running because I have to do this or God is going to be mad at me. Right? The second place that legalism tends to show up is when I start putting that on other people. When I start saying, God will not be happy with you and you and you, and I get to determine, basically, I'm determining how God is going to be happy with you. I'm doing all this stuff. Why aren't you doing all this stuff? And we start projecting it on other people. That's where most people see legalism at work, but it really starts with one person. Okay, legalism starts in here. So that's one side. The other side is nomism. Comes from the Greek word nomos, which, good. You've heard that word a lot, right? It means law or rule. And nomism then says that the law is required to rule the Christian life. And that one sounds a little bit better because, yes, there is law in the Christian life. Okay, we're not bound to the Mosaic law, but that doesn't mean we have no law, because what they're arguing, what Paul's detractors are arguing, is the opposite extreme of nomism. You say, I thought we just did legalism. Well, there's another one, nomism, way over here, and just start tearing them apart, is Antinomianism, which says, no law for anybody. We can do anything we want at any time, and God can't do anything about it, basically. Sin doesn't matter at all. Shall we continue in sin so the grace may abound? Yay! Right? That's antinomianism. So nomism is, even though I'm saved, I've got to be under this law. Antinomianism says, yay, free spirit, no law at all. Legalism says, God will never be happy with me unless I'm perfect. I have to keep doing all this stuff to make God happy with me. So what's the balance? What is the ism? Maybe you don't even know the ism. Maybe there's not an ism. But if it's not legalism and it's not nomism and it's not antinomianism, where should we be? What do you think? Those aren't the only three options. Yeah. Great free gracism, right? Gracism. Give me an ism. So what would gracism, if that were a thing, what would that be?
Well, you weren't supposed to ask me to define it.
Yeah, right.
I don't know.
Okay. Anybody else want to come up with a...
Trust.
Okay.
Trust that God loves me. I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing, and if I don't, He forgives me. And I don't have to be so worried about it because I know He's a God of love.
So it's loveism, right? Love. So it's free spirit with a conscience.
Okay.
Free spirit with a conscience. Antinomianism with a conscience. Like, that's not what I said. You don't know what you said. If it's not legalism, it's not nomism, it's not antinomianism, where's that balance? Where's that middle ground? Because we are under the law of Christ, obviously, the law of love. I mean, there is a great commandment, there's a great commission, there are things we're supposed to do, and yet those things aren't supposed to weigh us down like legalism and nomism tend to do. But we're not antinomianism because there are things that he's called us to do. So where's that balance? And what does living by faith look like when it comes to, I'm going to keep using the word law. Not necessarily Mosaic law, but just law in general.
There's a desire to follow the law, but that's born out of not fear of punishment or anything like that, but out of a desire to grow more like Christ.
Okay. Which is what you were saying, belief and trust. You were saying trust and faith. And so what you're saying is, okay, we know that there's a law to follow, and it's not supposed to completely weigh us down and beat us down, but it's not completely law-free. And where grace and faith and trust and all this stuff comes in as that is the rule of life. And our obedience then comes as a response to that. So, in our homes, when we're growing up, and then when we're parents and we place these things on our children, there are things that simply need to be done around the house, or that need to be done around the house simply because you're family, right? There are certain chores nobody likes to do, but just because you live in the house, just because you're family, you have to do those things, right? It's just part of being a family. You invite somebody over, okay, they don't have to do those chores. What? Why don't they have to do the chores? They're not a part of this house. It's your room, it's your bathroom, whatever the chore is. But there are some things that, and this of course comes with maturity usually, there are some things that we do simply because they need to be done, not because it's on the chore list, not because we're getting any kind of allowance or commission or paid for it, not because of any external influence, but it's just, it needs to be done, so we do it. We do it, and when we really strip everything away, we do it out of love for the family. Right? Not out of duty. And that difference between love and duty, I think, is that balance. Because duty is really the legalism, nomism side of things. Okay, I'm doing this because I have to, because Dad said so, because I'm required to do it, and possibly even the fear of consequences. Right.
That's the nomism. The legalism is, why do I have to do this and nobody else is doing it?
That's true. That's true. And there's the difference between nomism and legalism, right? If I have to do this, you have to do it too. Yep.
Take out the trash. Nobody else will load the dishwasher. Yeah, that kind of thing.
Perfect. That's a great. Yeah, that's exactly right. That would be the difference between nomism and legalism. That would be that. But in the middle, what we want our kids to come to is, we serve each other, we help each other simply because we love each other, just because we're family. Not because there's a list on the thing. Yeah, the list is there. That just helps us remember what we need to do, but we're not driven by the list. And I think that's that trust or faith or grace or whatever, love or whatever term you want to use. That's where God, wow, that's where God wants us to get to. Is we're building one another up, we're loving Him, we're serving each other simply because we can, and we love to, and we want to. And that's where the Galatians had not gotten, and that's where, in fact, most of the letters that we find in the New Testament, the people had not gotten, which is why we have the letters telling them to do that, which is why we know that's what we're supposed to be getting to, because they hadn't yet. Right? So we don't want legalism, we don't want nomism, we don't want antinomianism, we want to live by faith. And in fact, that will actually come up.
So is there an ism?
Possibly even tonight. No.
Okay.
Not that I'm aware of.
I can tell you more isms that it's not.
Mm-hmm. There's a lot of isms that it's not. I would call it really the outcome of, to use our term, the path. I would say it's just the outcome. So free grace, there's a term that's used a lot right now. It's free grace, which is not well defined. Some people limit it only to salvation. Some people open it up to salvation and discipleship, whatever. I would fit it under the umbrella of free grace. We have the grace given to us freely, and we freely serve out of that, if it were the broader umbrella. But I'm not sure there is an ism that goes along with it.
Well, I wasn't sure because you kind of, in your thing, when you were asking, said, oh, maybe there isn't an ism, but I didn't know if maybe there was something in the back of your head that some really obscure word like nomism that none of us were going to know anyway.
Bibliophile.
Yeah, I knew that one.
I love it. Right at break, Daniel jumped up and I saw him take off down the hallway. I'm like, I peeked my head around the corner. I'm like, you went to check out my library, didn't you? Yep. By the way, this whole thing right here, this legalism, nomism thing, that's exactly what Paul was learning to deal with in Romans chapter 7. That's what Romans chapter 7 is about. In chapter 4 and 5, we see how to be justified through faith. In chapter 6, he says, so give your body over to God as instruments of righteousness. Great. Chapter 7, now I can obey the law. Now I have to obey the law. And he just keeps getting beat down, beat down, beat down, beat down. And at the end of chapter 7 is where we find the things I want to do, I find myself not doing. The things I don't want to do, I find myself doing. And at the end of the chapter, he's like, oh, wretched man that I am, who will rescue me from this body of death? It's like, I just can't do it. Because he was doing that. That's what he was trying, that's what he was still wrestling with. And then he gets into chapter 8 and he says, look at what I found out. I don't have to do it. I live by the Spirit. I walk by the Spirit. I walk in faith and grace and love and all these things. And when I'm walking by the Spirit, I don't end up doing these things. Yeah. Yep. Question number 3. Did I change? Yeah. It seems like they were being persecuted. Verse 4, have you suffered so many things for nothing? If indeed it was for nothing. So his question was, so all this persecution that you've been facing, is that for nothing? Is that in vain if you could have done this all by yourself anyway? If this is all about what you're doing and you didn't have to follow God and you just had to, do these things, why are you going through all the persecution? What was all that for? You were sticking up for it and now you're not. What's the difference? What's changed here? Okay. Why are you suffering for Jesus? And then number 4, so you've had some miracles. Paul did some miracles, it seems probably there. Verse 5, does God then give you the Spirit and work miracles because you were doing the works of the law or by believing what you heard? So why did you do all these things? By the way, and this is just a note, but just because we find miracles doesn't mean that God is actually the one doing that. We've talked about that before. Miracles are not a guarantee that God is at work. Satan can do miracles too. Okay? In fact, since we have time, I'm going to do another little excursus. There were only in the Bible 5 periods of signs, miracles, and wonders. Like chunks of signs, miracles, and wonders, usually with centuries in between. Where were they? Who remembers? Who can come up? What do you come up with? 5 periods of signs, miracles, and wonders. Moses? Yep. Yeah, that was the obvious one. That was that we're going to just call a one-off, okay. not a period, because there are
5 or 6 off, but okay.
What?
Well, he told him his dream and interpreted.
Well, okay, so so prophecy, prophet. That's fine. Nope.
So, okay.
All right. Yeah. So Elijah and Elisha. So we're doing like 60 recorded, whatever, 60 recorded.
That's true. It was more focused on the Babylonians than the Israelites.
Yeah, it's true. So you've got Moses, you got Elijah and Elisha. Okay, he did a couple, right? Jesus is always the answer, right? Jesus.
Well, then the apostles.
So we can make a distinction because Jesus did, and then the apostles, right? The early church, right?
Well,
Paul is part of the early church.
okay.
What's that?
The apostles when they're with Jesus.
So Jesus and the apostles are one, and then I would say the beginning of the church and the
Post-ascension, yes, that's what it was.
post-ascension. So then the apostles, which would include Paul.
Okay,
So that's 4.
Revelation.
Hey, good. The Revelation. The Revelation. And who's doing signs, miracles, and wonders in the Revelation?
The Antichrist.
Through the power of Satan. Satan is doing signs, miracles, and wonders. In
Well,
fact, second.
Going back to the Exodus, and they didn't repeat all of them, but Moses does a miracle or whatever, and the magicians copy it.
Yep.
Yeah.
Which really does not make a lot of sense to me. It's like, you can turn it into blood, so can we. Wait a minute. That may not be a good plan. You can bring frogs out, so... More frogs. At some point, we're just expounding it. Yeah, Pharaoh's like, I don't need you anymore.
How much of a show of power would it have been for them to say, I can turn it back.
Right.
I can get rid of the frogs, but they couldn't.
Right, they couldn't, so they just kept doing it until they were 3 or 4 in, and they couldn't even do it anymore. Right? They just lost their ability. In the future, during the 70th week, the tribulation, 2 Thessalonians says that Antichrist will come with Satan's power and do signs and miracles and wonders. So yeah, you got Moses, yeah, that's great, God's power, and Elijah and Elisha, God's power, and Jesus, of course, God's power, and the apostles, God's power. Miracles show God's power. Not always. Not always. We've got magicians that, like you're talking about in Exodus, we've got magicians that, even Paul, Peter, actually, Acts 8, Simon the magician. Yep, Simon the magician. And Philip, actually. It was Philip. And he's following Philip around. He's just like, that is so cool. What does it cost for me to get that power? Yep, the sons of Sceva. Yep. So we've got plenty of illustrations, but Antichrist is by far the largest, where there's going to be years worth of signs, miracles, and wonders. And it's, of course, God is doing his judgments and their stuff, but the actual what looks like God's power is not going to be God's power at all. To the point that at the midpoint of the 70th week, Antichrist will either, and it's hard to tell which, and we really don't know, but he will either be killed and resurrected, or he will have a wound that will bring him to the point of death, and it will look as if he's been resurrected. He may or may not actually die and come back to life. It's going to be really close if he doesn't. Satan will, and you said mimic, Satan will counterfeit literally all the way. He will counterfeit everything up to the resurrection to get his guy as the Messiah of the world at that point, all the way to the resurrection. Now, whether it's true resurrection or not, I haven't decided for where I stand on that, but I'm personally, some people say Satan could never bring somebody back to life. I'm not convinced of that. Maybe he could. I'm not convinced that he couldn't. It's not, something I'm going to, die over or anything, argue about, but I think he might. I think he might. So,
Doesn't that kind of kill the conquering death thing? The idea of the post-conquering death? If Satan can do it too?
well, I think what I would think is that it would be a kind of and maybe resurrection isn't quite the right word, because from the midpoint on, he's actually possessed by Satan himself.
He's just wearing an Antichrist suit then.
Could be, yeah. An Egger suit, right, yeah. What's that?
Like a resuscitation versus
Yeah, you know, Jesus did, Jesus,
actual resurrection 3 days later, a body that was pronounced dead 3 days later coming back to life versus someone who we just pronounced dead, performed CPR, now
Yeah.
they're back to life.
yeah, so Lazarus was I mean, technically he was resuscitated in a sense on the fourth day because he did die again, right? And Jesus brought back to life at least 2 other people, right? Peter brought back to life one other person. Elijah and Elisha brought back, or at least Elisha. So there have been instances of resurrections, but all those people died again. Jesus is the first of those who will be resurrected, who won't die again. But what's interesting is Antichrist will not die again. He'll make it all the way to the end of the 70th week, and he will be cast alive into the lake of fire. And 1,000 years later, he'll still be there at the end of the kingdom. So again, is it a resuscitation? Was he really dead, or was there something else going on? There's still enough. I'm not really sure. The Greek text is a little bit difficult there. It's not quite as clear as we would like it to be. It does, though, have the word as. It says at. What does it say? See, now you see. It's one thing for me to go on a rabbit trail, but when you take me on a rabbit trail.
I take rabbit trails off of your rabbit trails, then we're really in the woods.
Yep. They were made. Let's see. Here it is. And one of the heads. Oh yeah, that's right. That's this one. So remember just a couple weeks ago in 1 John that Cain violently slaughtered his brother, right? That's the word here in Revelation 13 for what happens to one of the heads of the beast. It says, and one of his heads, as violently slaughtered to death. And the wound of his death was healed. That's what it says. There are, so the dragon has 10 heads, and one of those heads is going to be wounded. So is it I think it's actually because then it says that the whole world was amazed at the beast and bowed down and worshiped the dragon, and because he had given his authority to the beast, his power to the beast, and they worshiped the beast, saying, "Who is like the beast, and who is able to to make war against him, to make more war with him?" So talking specifically not about the whole dragon, but about just one of those. Yeah. But he's going to have one of his heads is going to at least look like, it says, as being slaughtered to death. And the wound of his death was healed. So, anyway. How do we? Oh, miracles. Good. All right. Miracles. 5 periods throughout the Bible: signs, miracles, and wonders. And I mean, think how many hundreds of years were there from Moses to Elijah and Elisha? Anybody know? About 600. About 600 years. Okay. So we read through the Bible, and it's like, constantly doing miracles all the time. Once they got into the land, the manna stopped, everything stopped. They just had their stuff, and they were just doing life, just normal people doing life. And a prophet would pop up here and there, but it wasn't like it was tons of miracles all over the place. Miracles, I don't remember who said it, but somebody said if miracles happened all the time, we'd have to call them normals, right? They're not. They are that's right. Right. So then Elijah and Elisha come along, and there's this just like compact period, just like all the time. And then it stops for another 600 years or so, 800 years, I guess, at that point, until Jesus comes along. And they're just doing life, and they go into the captivity, and yeah, there's a couple, but not like for a long period of time. And Nehemiah and all these guys, and then 400 silent years, and yes, we get Hanukkah is in there. If the legend of Hanukkah actually happened, 1 day's worth of oil going into 8, that was certainly a miracle, no doubt about that. But again, it's a one-off thing. They're just doing life for 800 years. Then Jesus comes along, and there's miracles, and the apostles, miracles, and now it's 1900 years. And maybe we do see stuff. I mean, every time we pray for someone to be healed, we're asking for a miracle, right? We still believe in miracles. There's no doubt we believe that God can do miracles. What we don't believe is that he has miracle workers running around all over the place. There's a big difference between those two, right? And we're just doing life. And of course, salvation is a miracle and all of that too. But then there will be a time when they'll be seeing this on a regular basis. So just because there are miracles, Paul is not saying that you saw miracles and therefore it was God, but God was actually doing miracles to authenticate his message with them. And so, and then he brought it back in verse 6. He said, just as Abraham believed God and was credited him as righteousness. That was Genesis 15:6, and he really, really likes this verse. He quotes it here. He quotes it 3 times in Romans chapter 4. Okay, and his whole theology is built on Abraham believed God and it was credited him as righteousness. Nothing else. He didn't have to do anything else. And for the rest of this chapter now, Paul is going to show that relying on Moses, because circumcision was a sign of the covenant, we'll see that, but it was under the law, and that's what they're saying. You've got to obey the law. And what Paul's going to say is, if you go back only to Moses, you're not going back far enough. He says, I want to take us all the way back to Abraham, because Abraham was pre-law. Abraham didn't have the Mosaic law. Abraham was 600 years before the law. So how about if we go back a little bit further and see what was going on before? You guys are all caught up on the Mosaic law. Okay, you're coming in pretty late to the party. Let's go all the way back. Abraham's faith was pre-law, and so his faith is actually, this is why Paul uses Abraham, because we're not under the law either. And if it was all about this is how people under the law are saved, what does that do for you and me? What does that do for the Galatians back then? He has to take us back all the way pre-law and to see what does it look like for people who are not under the law, because now it works for us too. And he keeps going back to Abraham for that. Isn't that good? Good stuff. Questions, comments, thoughts, anything on 1 through 6? Okay. Probably not, because he spent 2 more chapters trying to talk him into it. Got that? Yeah. I'm thinking not. The Galatians, I think, ended up on the fence, but the people who were preaching to them were not convinced. And that's why we had to have the Jerusalem Council a year or 2 later, because in Acts 15, the apostles and the elders actually had to get together and say, so what's our story? What is our message going to be? And Paul brought up all of this stuff that he had been teaching, and Peter brought up his stuff, and Barnabas, and everybody had their chance to talk, and the Pharisees and the priests and everybody who were believers but were still trying to live under the law and legalistically push the law. Yep, the Judaizers, the Jewish legalists. In fact, it's funny, Judaizers is some translations use that word Judaizers, right? And I was chatting with a guy, a Jewish guy on Facebook several years ago, and I didn't use the word Judaizer, I used Jewish legalist. And he messaged me, he said, "Thank you so much for saying Jewish legalist," because when people say Judaizers, it condemns the entire, all of Judaism, like it was Judaism's fault. It wasn't. It was these guys who were taking just a part of it and trying to make a bigger deal. He said, "I really love that. Thanks for not calling them Judaizers, for calling them Jewish legalists." I'm like, glad to do my part, whatever. Yeah, right, yeah. So these guys, there were Pharisees who were saved. There were priests who were saved in Jerusalem. And at the Jerusalem Council, everybody had their say. I don't know how many days this thing went on, but everybody got to make their argument, stand up and make their argument. And then the apostles and the elders hashed through it. And James finally, Jesus' brother, stood up and said, "Men and brethren, listen to me. This is what we're going to do. We've heard everybody. You've all had your say. This is what we're going to do."
I wondered about that. Because back in chapter 2, it says these guys came,
Mm-hmm.
and they were like, I wonder if they were like Pharisees or somebody who already had a high rank before they got saved.
Yep.
So that's what they were held in
High esteem.
They already.
Yeah, we don't know who they are. What's really weird, because it says some men came from James. So does that mean they came from James's group, from Jerusalem? Paul would have said just from Jerusalem, right? Or did James send them up there to find out what's going on up there, and they came up with... Yeah, maybe James didn't intend it that way, but they intended it, and they saw what was going on and started freaking out, and we don't know. But that phrase, some men came from James, and immediately Peter backed off, and eventually Barnabas backed off, and just the whole thing. It's like, these guys must have carried some weight, right?
And when we were going through that, I thought of that and didn't say anything, but when you just now brought up,
Yeah.
I'm going to go ahead and say it.
Yeah.
That is what I was thinking.
Yeah.
Because that would be the only way, at least in my mind, that
Yep.
I could think of them as high, is because they were high.
Yeah. Were they Pharisees or priests or something already in Jerusalem? And so when they came up to Antioch, they're like, these are the guys. Yeah. They're never named. I really wish we knew, because I'm nosy,
It's obviously not significant, though.
Yeah. Yep.
But Paul doesn't use, like, the second time refer to them as those who think they're something.
No, that's referring to the apostles.
Oh, that's right.
Right. And that probably it may include them actually as part of just sort of the overall people in Jerusalem, but he was specifically talking about the apostles and those who seemed to be something. And there are a couple of times where he was like, "I'm not less of an apostle than those guys are." they're not, or they're not any more an apostle than I am, right? As he's defending himself. So yeah, he says, so understand then, understand, verse 7, so then understand that those who believe are the sons of Abraham. So, what?
I wasn't about to break out a song.
I'm singing over here really quietly.
You guys, I've never liked that song. Did he really?
The first line, and put a smiling face next to it.
Oh, jeez. I go months at a time without being tortured with that, and then somebody says something and it pops it up in my... All right. I didn't. All right, back to my notes. After rebuking the Galatians for not using their minds, he reminded them of the truth that they knew. It's the faith of Abraham, not the works of Abraham. Right? That makes someone a son of Abraham. And he says there, this is significant for 3 reasons, which means I probably have a list of 3 reasons. Number 1, Abraham was circumcised, but only after he believed unto righteousness. This is a huge point because, well, Abraham was circumcised, wasn't he? Yes, he was, but not until Genesis 17. And Paul insists on quoting Genesis 15. He takes it back before Abraham was circumcised, before Abraham was even Abraham. Hadn't even had his name changed yet. He was still Abram back there in Genesis 15. So yes, he was circumcised eventually, not until after the covenant, not until after he believed in faith. That came later. The circumcision was meant to be the sign of the covenant, the reminder of the covenant. It wasn't the covenant itself. You didn't become circumcised in order to get into the covenant. You got circumcised because you were already part of the covenant in the nation of Israel. Okay, it was a symbol of the covenant. And so that's number one. He said, listen, those who believe are the sons of Abraham, not those who do things are the sons of Abraham. And the scripture, foreseeing that God would justify Gentiles by faith, proclaimed the gospel to Abraham ahead of time. And the gospel there could just mean the good news, but there's different. Good gospel just means good news. Obviously not the gospel of the cross. Okay. All the nations will be blessed in you. That goes all the way back, by the way, to Genesis 12. That's not even 15. So God had made a promise to Abraham even before he did the covenant. So number two, Paul's focus is on Gentiles. Okay, all Jews are sons of Abraham, but even their circumcision did not gain them righteousness. Okay, the circumcision was the sign of God's covenant with Israel, the family of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It was never with the Gentiles anyway. Never. So why in the world would these people think that now the Gentiles have to do it? They never had to do it anyway. In fact, a Gentile could come and join Israel and worship God as a resident foreigner in Israel and not be circumcised. That was never a requirement. So why would it be a requirement all of a sudden after the cross? So that's number two. God's going to justify Gentiles by faith or through faith, right? Number three. Believing Gentiles are not added to Abraham's or Israel's blessings. Okay, notice it doesn't say, it says all the nations will be blessed in you so that those who believe are blessed along with Abraham the believer. It doesn't say that they're receiving all of the same blessings. It says that they will be blessed. And most specifically, it says that they will be made righteous when we keep it in the context here. Okay? So will all of the nations, the Gentile nations is the word there, will all of the nations receive exactly the same blessings as Abraham? No. Because if we go back to Genesis chapter 12, God said, I'm going to do all this for you, Abraham, and then through you, other nations will be blessed. It doesn't say all the nations are going to have all the same stuff that you have, all the same blessings. It's that you, and in fact, in Genesis 22, I think it is, it's either 22 or 28, just 22, I think it is, it actually switches the tense of the verb and it says, and all nations will bless one another through your name. Not just be blessed through your name, but they will actually bless one another through your name because of what's coming from Abraham, coming through Abraham. So, Abraham the believer, by the way, isn't that a great phrase? It could be a title. I've just got this note. It could be a title, Abraham the faithful, which is really cool because it could mean that. The believer, the faithful, the believing Abraham, they'll be blessed along with. But I really like Abraham the believer or Abraham the faithful. I really like reading that as a title almost. All right, verse 10. For all who rely on doing the works of the law are under a curse. Because it's written, cursed is everyone who does not keep on doing everything written in the book of the law. Notice that anyone who is attached to the law finds themselves under a curse. Anyone who's attached to the law finds themselves having to obey it flawlessly. Let's put it that way. That's why the curse comes in. Because once you're bound to the law, you've got three options for not being under a curse. There's only three ways to not be under a curse. Number one, you obey it flawlessly, right? You have to obey it. Or number one, you don't become attached to it at all. Then you never have to worry about it. Number two, if you are attached to it at any time, you have to follow it perfectly. Okay? Or number three, if you're attached to it, you have to be released by the lawgiver. Those are the only ways to get out from being a failure and being under the curse. That's it. So don't become attached to it at all. Woohoo, Gentiles. Yay, we're not attached to it at all. Three is be released from that law code by the lawgiver who actually is the one who sets the rules. A kind of pardon, yeah.
Okay, but in the case of the Gentiles, you got to be released by God.
Well, we were never under the law to begin with. That's the point.
But under the Mosaic law, though. I mean, so Jews, not us.
Jews, right.
But Jews couldn't be released. I didn't know if they were talking about that.
No. To actually be pardoned. You use the word pardon, or to be, redeemed or something. We'll get to that in a couple of verses here. Yeah. Right. And that's what's going on here. The thing is that here's what James said, is there is, he didn't say this, but here's an illustration. Think of the law like a chain. The whole thing is bound together. If you break even one part, the chain's useless, right? The whole chain falls apart. Okay. Now there are some people who say that when James says that if you do one sin, you're guilty of the whole thing. It's like in fact, some people say all sins are equal in God's sight, because if you break any one, it's like you've broken the whole law. It's not what it says. Number one, not all sins are equal in God's sight. Number two, it doesn't say if you've broken one sin, you've broken the whole, or if you've made one sin, you've broken the whole law. So those 2 points. Number one, all sins are not equal in God's sight. The Bible never says all sins are equal in God's sight. Any given sin makes us a sinner. There's no doubt about that. But all sins are not equal in God's sight. And we can look, the law is a perfect example. Look in the law. Is the death penalty the punishment for every sin? No. For some sins, it's the death penalty. For some sins, it's a sacrifice. Well, how did they get off so easy? They just have to do a sacrifice. I'm condemned to death if I do this. Because sins don't weigh the same. There are weights to sin. If you look through really the whole Bible, not even just the New Testament, but especially we see this in the New Testament, but sexual sin seems to be weigh very heavily. It keeps getting so much face time, like it's some of the worst things. All sins are not equal in God's sight. What James is saying, that if you break one, it's not like you've broken them all. It's you're guilty of breaking it, because it's like a chain. It's done. It's the guilt of it is the same no matter which one that you break, but the punishment is not necessarily the same. Okay? So that's number one. Not all sins are the same in God's sight. Number two, I don't remember number two.
Number two, you said, listed it as being guilty of, you've broken them all. But you added that number one when you just did it. But when you were saying
Right, yeah, right. Okay, good. Yes. Yes, thank you. Good. All right. So number one is they're not all equal in God's sight. Number two is if you've broken one, it doesn't mean that you've committed them all. It's just that now you're under the guilt, as if, just like you would be with any one of them, right? You're not, the whole, it's so James 2:10. You said James 2:10 is why don't you just close it? Sounds like it sounds like my brain's gone for tonight, right? Guilty of all of it, right? The one who obeys the whole law but fails in one point has become guilty of all of it. You don't just get to stand up to God and say, well, I only broke one. So that's not so bad. You can let me in for that. You can get me off of that. God says, no, even one makes you a sinner. Even one puts you in infinite violation against God and His character. Now, they may not weigh the same, they may not carry the same consequences, but any one of them brings the guilt on us, right? So, there's nobody who can go through their entire. Hey, look, I got James 2:10 in my notes right there. There it is. The law is similar to a chain. That's the illustration that I was using. One must forge every single link securely, or it will not support the person who clings to it for salvation. That is the quote that I have in my notes here. And we see James 2:10. So how do we make sure that we're never cursed by failing in even one point? Well, don't become attached to it at all, which for Gentiles, that's awesome. Okay, great, we're not. For Jews, they didn't have a choice. God said, here's your law. Hold on a second. Actually, what God said was, if I gave you this law, would you do it? And they're like, yes, we'll do everything the Lord has commanded. And Moses and God both looked at them and said, really? Are you sure you want to sign on the dotted line here? Yes, everything the Lord has commanded we will do. Okay, now you're attached to it.
I was thinking about that even with the conversation about the Limujii and everything. It's like the same, the Jewish people, again, saying, we can do all of this. We've got this, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So, now, okay, you're under it. Now you got to be perfect. You got to follow it perfectly. You'll never be cursed if you follow it perfectly. Well, that's just great. So, okay, now we're cursed because we didn't follow it perfectly. Now what are our options? Well, in a fair world, your only option is the consequences for breaking the law. Because that's fair. Right? Option number 3 up there isn't fair. Grace, by definition, isn't fair. Mercy, by definition, isn't fair. Because fair says, if you do the crime, you do the time. There is no getting off. There is no getting off for good behavior. There is no anything. If you do it, you've done the deed, so you have to pay the consequences. That's fair. And a lot of people run around saying, God's not fair. God, you're right, is not fair. Yeah, the last thing we want is for God to be fair. If God were fair, we wouldn't be having this conversation. Right? God is absolutely not fair. He's just, like we were talking about this morning, but He's gracious, and grace blows fairness out of the water. We don't want Him to be fair. We don't want Him to be fair. So that's how option number 3 even becomes a possibility. And the thing that they were forgetting is what he says here in verse 11. Now it is clear that no one is justified before God by the law. Guess what? Even obeying the law flawlessly wouldn't have saved anybody. Apparently, because God, the law, and we see this throughout Hebrews as well, the law couldn't save anybody. It never was intended to. The only way somebody could do it is if they were already perfect, but it wasn't perfection that made them saved. See, nobody could, even because, and here's this comes from Habakkuk, or Habakkuk, depending on how you want to pronounce it. Chapter 2, verse 4, the righteous one will live by faith. And Paul's already quoted this in Romans chapter 1 as well. And I don't like it. Just saying. I don't like this translation because it reorders the words. I don't like the translation because the translation is the righteous will live by faith, or the just shall live by faith. How do you hear that? What do you hear when you hear the just shall live by faith?
Faith comes after. It means like someone who's been declared just, then lives by faith.
Then they live out their life by faith, right?
It seems like the just part comes first.
The
I
just.
know that's not how it actually should work.
Yep. That's exactly how most people hear it. That's how I heard it for a long time, right? In the quotation, in the original statement, and then in all of the quotations, this is how it reads: "The just by faith will live." That changes it, doesn't it? It's not just that the just are going to live by faith, which is how we usually hear it. It's not that the just live by faith, but the just by faith will live. That's how the Russian has it, is in that order. Russian wins. Russian's the winner today, because that's the correct translation, and that's the correct interpretation that comes out of it. The NLT? Yes, it is through faith that a righteous person has life. That carries the intended meaning. Most of our translations put it the other way around. The just shall live by faith. And when I grew up reading this and memorizing these verses and hearing this, I just assumed that meant that righteous people have to live by faith. Got to live by faith. Got to live by faith. What's that?
Kind of have to
Be faithful. Yep.
Yeah.
Be faithful. But that's not what it says. The text says that the just, the righteous person, by faith, will live. It's always been by faith will live, or through faithful from faith will live.
It isn't quoted exactly from the back, because I looked at the back.
Yeah.
It still has the right, but it says, "But the righteous will live by their faithfulness to God."
In Habakkuk. Oh, interesting. So now we have to look that up.
With a little star and a whole bunch of notes down there.
It's crazy. This comes in Habakkuk right after he tells him that I'm going to destroy your nation in your lifetime.
Yep. For what it's worth, in the Hebrew text that I have here, and the righteous person, through his faith, will live, or by his faith will live, even in Habakkuk. So, yeah. Yep. Even that same order, even in Habakkuk. So, and we see this in Romans, and we see this in Galatians, and we see this in Habakkuk. It's never been about, no one will ever be, everyone has been, no one ever before. It's never been about justification through works. It's always been about justification through faith, and that's how we have life. But the law is not based on faith. That's his big point as he goes through. The law is not based on faith. What do I have here? Do I have a slide? I have a slide. Even if someone thinks they can follow it perfectly, it doesn't matter, because justification was never tied to the law anyway. Habakkuk 3:2. Okay, that's a typo. That's supposed to be 2:4. The righteous by faith shall live, and the law is not based on faith. And then verse 12. We have to remember the law is not based on faith, but the one who does the works of the law will live by them. It's interesting. They will be basically the one who does the works of the law. They're going to have to, same thing, follow them. What's interesting, and this comes back to the whole curse thing. What's interesting that people forget is the Mosaic law was not just the religious law, but it was the civil law of the nation of Israel. It was their constitution. Okay? Just so we forget about this sometimes. Just because somebody had to make a sacrifice sometimes doesn't mean that they sinned. It wasn't sin all the time. Sacrifices did other things. And we'll see this in the millennial kingdom as well. There will be animal sacrifices, not to pay for sin or cover sin, but basically to pay fines because we broke the law, broke the civil law. Not we. We'll be glorified. We're not sinning at all. We're not disobeying at all. But sometimes sometimes there were things that they couldn't help, and they just needed ceremonial cleanness, right? So I've got to be ceremonial clean before I, go back to the tabernacle or whatever. Some things were just, I did this. It's not really a sin necessarily, but it broke the civil law, so I have to pay my fine. And then, of course, there are some things that would actually be sin from a more religious or spiritual sense. What the Gentiles never had the Mosaic law, not as a religious law, not as a civil law. But according to Romans chapter 2, God has stamped his basic moral code on our consciences. In every civilization, everywhere across the planet, people who've never even heard or care about Israel still have God's moral code stamped on our hearts and on our consciences. And so when we stand before God, when unbelievers stand before God at the great white throne in Revelation chapter 20, they will be judged according to their deeds. Sometimes we, as Christians, get so focused on the fact that deeds can't get us to heaven, works can't get us to heaven, that when we hear somebody say, "Oh, well, I'm try to be good, and hopefully my good deeds will outweigh my bad deeds," we're like, "Well, your deeds aren't even going to be judged at all. It's whether you're saved." That's not exactly true. Destination has to do with whether they're saved, but the actual punishment will be based on their lives, how they responded to the moral code that they had. So there's going to be the books are opened, and they will be judged according to the things that are written in the books. And then another book is opened, and that's the book of life. And those whose names are not found written in the book of life are cast to the lake of fire. But their judgment, their punishment is based on what they did. And when we bring the entire context of Scripture together, it's what they did based on what they knew. God never holds somebody accountable for something that they don't know, at least from what I can tell. God never holds somebody accountable for what they don't know. Okay? Are you frowning at me?
I am. Did you just say that even unsaved people have different levels of punishment?
Yes.
Where?
Dante's Inferno is the...
I mean, hell is hell, right?
Well...
Is it hotter for some people? I mean, like...
Yeah, there is a concept that the punishment that a person... So hell is the separation from God, right? So that is the same for every unbeliever, right? But you've got some who are there and they were really, really good people. They did all the law and everything, and they're just... I don't know that it's a farther away from God, but it's I do believe that there are levels of punishment. Yeah. In the same way that there are levels of reward. So everybody goes to heaven, and there's the super faithful and there's the super unfaithful, but they were saved, so they got in. So, are they in the back row further away from God? How does that... I don't know that we know all the details of how it works.
Well, how about keeping a coal on their head?
Well, that's keeping coals on the heads of your enemies.
In this life.
Yeah.
Yep. Romans 12. Yeah.
Go and preach, and Matthew 10 verse 16 says, "True, I say to you, it will be more tolerable for the land of Sodom and Gomorrah in the day of judgment. Than for that city.
Who rejects,
Who reject their
yep, yep,
gospel teaching.
yep. And he
We're
just said,
discussing like why, because Sodom and Gomorrah never knew the actual gospel, and Jesus was right there.
yep,
The Messiah wasn't coming from.
yep. And so when they rejected him,
Their punishment would be more severe.
yep, yep. And he says something similar in chapter 12.
Which I know there's that comparison with Sodom and Gomorrah, you know, like obviously some sins are, but I've always, I guess, related that to some sins are worse than others, not the. Some sins is different, I guess.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah. Yeah, so on the day of, just for the sake of the recording, on the day of judgment, there will be, Jesus said in at least Matthew chapters 10 and 12, at least two different occasions, he said it'll be more tolerable or it'll be better for them in the day of judgment than it will be for you. He said that against Capernaum, Chorazin, Bethsaida, and he compared them to places like Sodom and Gomorrah, Tyre, Sidon. In fact, this is one of the things when I teach Matthew, he said, in fact, I'll tell you that if the miracles that were done in you were done in them, they would have repented, and you didn't. So that actually shows his omniscience as well, right? They would have repented. They didn't even get the chance, and so it'll be better for them. So yeah, I think there are. Thanks, Vera. That's exactly right. I think that's true. Yep. Let's see. And then okay, let's finish up. 13 and 14. Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us, because it is written, "Cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree," in order that in Christ Jesus the blessing of Abraham would come to the Gentiles, so that we could receive the promise of the Spirit by faith. Two big points that I want to make here. Number one, redeemed. The word he uses here is ex agorazo. There's two other words also translated redeem. One of them is just agorazo, and the other one is lutrao. Now, here's the fun part. Does anybody know what agoraphobia is? Agoraphobia? Fear of open spaces, going out open spaces, right? The way it got that name is because the agora is the marketplace. That's what it was. You look at ancient Greek or whatever. The agora is the marketplace. That's what it means. So to agorazo, to take that thing and turn it into a verb, is basically to buy something. That's what it means, is to purchase something. The word ek or ex, when we slap that onto the front, it means out from or out of. So what he did here, the word he used here is he redeemed, he ex agorazoed, he bought out from the market. He bought and then removed from the market. Lutrao, the other one, means to set free or to pay a ransom. It's also translated redeem sometimes. And so these are three words that each have a different nuance when it comes to the topic of redemption. Well, here he said Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by ex agorazoing. He bought us on the marketplace and then removed us. He took us out from the marketplace. Okay? And so really, the only way to not come under the law's curse, if you're already attached to it, is to be redeemed or released by the lawgiver himself. This is why God is the only one who can do this. Now, here's what's interesting, though. Look at the little words. The little words sometimes mean a lot. We read this in our system. Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us. Isn't that so good? He redeemed us by becoming a curse for us, so that in Christ Jesus the blessing of Abraham would come to the Gentiles, so that we could receive the promise of the Spirit by faith. Who's the us, and we? Jews. Remember, we weren't under the law. Gentiles weren't under the law, so Gentiles weren't under that part of the curse anyway. Now, it's true, we're under the broader curse of sin. We just weren't under the curse of the law. And it's true that Jesus redeemed us from the curse of sin. But you and I were not redeemed from the curse of the law. So that hymn that says that we're redeemed from the curse of the law doesn't fly because it's not us. Free from the law, oh happy condition. Okay? Jesus' blood and there's remission. That part is true, the remission. But free from the law, oh happy condition. I was never part of the law. I was never under the law anyway. Christ has redeemed us once for all. That's the name of the song. Christ has redeemed us. He didn't redeem us from the curse of the law because we weren't under the curse of the law. The us and the we are the Jews here. And he sets it apart from the Gentiles. God did that for Jews so that he could also do this for Gentiles, so that he could also do this for the Jews. There is a distinction there. When the Jewish Messiah became a curse for the Jews, he opened the way to fulfill the Abrahamic blessings for Gentiles as well. In a sense, he had to save them from more. He had to save, yes.
He didn't save them more, but he saved them
From more. Yes. Yes. Yep. Jews had to be saved from more than Gentiles had to be saved from because they had both the curse of sin and the curse of the law, and we just had the curse of sin. Yep. Isn't that great? Isn't that cool stuff? Yay. Okay. Any final thoughts, questions, comments, anything?
Did we hit Luke 12 when we were talking about levels of health?
I didn't even hear what you were saying. Sorry. Luke 12 what?
Luke 12, the servant who knows the master's will and does not get ready, does not do as the master wants, will be beaten with many blows. But the one who does not know and does things to deserving punishment will be beaten with fewer blows. They were using this as an example of less pain and hell.
Yep. Yep. Manager. Yes.
12, 47, 48.
Yep. Yep. And that would even be Israel specific as well too. When the Son of Man comes to judge Israel, but the principle, yeah, I think the principle is true for Jews and Gentiles that the more we know, the more we're responsible for, and the more we reject, the more discipline or punishment, depending on the case, there will be. Yeah.
Well, then I have to argue, though, with the initial premise of your comments about the judgment and everything, that people that say, oh, I try to live a good life, it doesn't really do them any good if they know better. I don't go to church and I don't believe in all that stuff. I just try to live a good life.
Mm-hmm.
They obviously know there's something else. So their judgment's not going to be less just because they live by a good moral code.
Well, they at least obeyed the moral code that they had. It won't change their destiny, but they didn't. There are a lot of people who break a lot of laws and they know they shouldn't, but I can't keep myself from doing it. I know I should and I know I shouldn't. We all know we shouldn't. Some people get hardened to that, right? And then they go off and do it anyway, and some people don't get hardened to it. And well, I'm going to be a good person and hope that it weighs out in the end. So God gave everybody the basic moral code on our hearts to keep us, number one, to help keep us straight. Number two, to show us that, so in the same way as the law, we'll see starting next time, the law, the purpose of the law was to actually show them that they were sinners, that they couldn't do it, that they needed more. And the moral code on our conscience serves as a similar thing. Romans 2 says that if our conscience condemns us or if our conscience doesn't condemn us, then there's a difference in how that plays out. So yeah, I live my whole life and my conscience never condemns me, still separated from God for eternity, but there somehow, and I don't think we have all the details, somehow it won't be as bad as somebody who just violated their conscience left and right, and at least the basic moral code all the way through. Because that even if they didn't have all the revelation, they had at least that much.